So only the leftish Palestinians, they criticize the policies here.
Wir haben es hier mit einer extremen Form des importierten Antisemitismus zu tun.
Importierter Hass, Antisemitismus auf Deutschlands Straßen.
Der muslimisch-arabische Antisemitismus, wir haben ihn seit dem 7. Oktober überall, wir haben ihn in allen Städten.
So you have a deeply vested anti-Semitism within the leftist movement, and it was always that case. Why? And Adolf Hitler, he also played with that.
Islamophobia is surging across the West, fueled by the growing strength of far-right movements, particularly in Germany.
Was sind die an?
Ich steche, das ist kein Scherz, ich steche jeden ab, der arabisch aussieht. Endlich muss mal Schluss sein hier in Deutschland.
Schlag den Deutschen Ausländer aus!
Das Gift des Islams, das erreicht die Köpfe.
Eine andere kulturelle Vorstellung haben, weil sie ein anderes Frauenbild haben.
The AfD party, with connections to neo-Nazi elements, has gained significant traction, becoming the second most popular political force in the country.
Muslimische Antisemiten in den Flieger setzen und ab in die Heimat. Tschüss und nicht auf Wiedersehen. Dass selbst ein Teil der Grünen inzwischen AfD-Position übernimmt, das nennen wir eine Zeitenwende.
Endorsed by Elon Musk and right-wing figures globally, the AfD's rise has positioned its leader as the strongest contender for Germany's top political position.
The media wants to portray AfD as far-right, as somehow associated with Nazism or something like that. Perhaps you could...
Back then, during the Third Reich, the National Socialists, as the word says, they were socialists. Adolf Hitler considered... Yeah.
They nationalized industries like crazy.
Yes, absolutely. He was a communist and he considered himself as a socialist.
2025 will be a crucial year, and the information in this video is necessary to prepare you to understand the rise of a new fascist tide. Now, with the rise of the far right in the former Hitler country, who do you single out as the main danger for anti-Semitism? Muslims, of course, the same marginalized group the AfD has made their main enemy. Palestine in particular has accelerated state repression and racist agitation against Arab and Muslim communities. This development is not just showcased in the ascent of the AfD, but virtually all the major parties have shifted to the right. Even some self-described Antifa groups have joined in this offensive, demanding more aggressive deportations of migrants in times of intensifying capitalist contradictions. There was even a scandal in the Die Linke, the most left-wing party in the German parliament, where a leader of one local chapter posted this, bringing up the theory as well. One powerful narrative that enables the acquiescence to the far right under a liberal progressive guise is what Cambridge professor Ezra Özürek calls the export-import theory of anti-Semitism. The theory argues that German anti-Semitism was first spread to the Middle East by German missionaries in the 19th century and later by Nazis in the 20th century. After World War II, this anti-Semitism was brought back to Germany by Muslim immigrants, reintroducing an issue in the country which had worked very hard to overcome it. According to the theory, these immigrants are seen as bringing Germany's past problems into the present, and that they remain tied to Germany's shameful past until they address their anti-Semitism. Over the past 2 decades, discourse has increasingly framed Muslims as the primary carriers of anti-Semitism, portraying their attitudes as external to German society and more dangerous than those of right-wing Germans. In this video, we will look at the history of this development and how this narrative is a complete fabrication. So while people around the world are worried about the return of German fascism, German ruling propaganda employs some new ideological tricks to outsource Nazi guilt to Muslims, painting oppressed communities not as victims but as perpetrators, thereby facilitating far-right rhetoric to become mainstream in times of decaying imperialism, not just in Germany, but all over the West. Before starting, I want to say thank you to all my Patreon supporters. Your contributions make this content possible by covering the time spent on research and editing. Every patron makes a difference, so if you'd like to help, check the link in the description. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to not miss the videos on the AfD during the coming German elections in February. Thank you. In the 2000s, a group of migrant background women gathered in Berlin's Neukölln district to study the Holocaust. This educational session was part of a program focused on fostering German accountability for the Holocaust. The lessons there left the women deeply disturbed. How could a society turn so fanatical, wondered one participant, a Turkish woman named Nazmiye, as she reflected on the experience. We began to ask ourselves if they could do such a thing to us as well, whether we could find ourselves in the same position as the Jews. Later, during a church visit arranged by the program, these women shared their concerns, provoking an intense reaction from their German hosts. Quote, "They told us to go back to our countries if this is how we think." The visit ended immediately, and the women were asked to leave. This story, told in Özürek's fantastic book, Subcontractors of Guilt, and in this popular article from Jewish Currents, typifies how Germany has made Holocaust remembrance into a tool of racist exclusion. As discussed in my last videos, the United States led denazification efforts in West Germany through an array of socio-psychological tools. American social scientists, for instance, argued that Hitler's rebellious attitude appealed to Germans because men in pre-Nazi Germany felt stuck between being strict at home and submissive at work. Fathers were regarded as responsible for steering their sons toward authoritarianism. The idea of democratic fatherhood became popular by the 50s, promoting the belief that raising children in such families would prepare them for responsible social and political roles and away from the fascist mindset. We will come back to this sort of child psychology later. Meanwhile, Karl Jaspers, a prominent German philosopher, called for a new German community bound together by collective guilt and empathy, but not between German and Jew, but between German and German. Prominent figure of the Frankfurt School, Theodor Adorno, who now lived in the US, believed that proper education was the solution to deal with authoritarianism, emphasizing critical self-reflection and confrontational social psychology. But all of this contradicted the main sentiment in West Germany, which didn't exactly take responsibility for the Holocaust. The Americans seemingly did everything to denazify Germany, except, well, denazify Germany, as they made sure to integrate former Nazis in virtually all of West German institutions. I'm sorry that I repeat this point in every video, but, you know, more people need to hear it. To recap the point of the last two videos, it's important to keep in mind that West Germany took multiple decades to arrive at the hollow memory culture today. First, much of Germany saw itself as the victim of foreign rule. Up until the 80s, 3 decades after the Holocaust, conservative German historians said that while Nazi crimes were brutal, they could be compared to those of the USSR, and that they often were reasonable reactions to the Bolshevik class genocide. This was part of the Historikerstreit, historians' dispute. In 2020, there would be a round 2 between scholars regarding the comparability of the Holocaust, but more on that later in this video. As communism weakened, Arab and Muslim leaders served to distract from a still Nazified Germany. Abdel Nasser was called the Hitler on the Nile, Yasser Arafat was a Hitler too, and Saddam Hussein was another Adolf. This narrative held the conflicting German-Israeli relations intact. West Germany could whitewash its Nazi contamination. Israel would shut up about it, and in return receive material help to fight against the Arab leaders, which were now the new Nazis, and not the actual Nazis who were dominant in West Germany. this background is still an important basis for what's happening today. It was only decades later, just after the old Nazis who had worked in every institution retired, when Germans felt proud that they learned from the past and felt really guilty about it, but also very proud that they did so. Most obscenely, an increasing number of people began to psychologically identify with Jewish Holocaust victims. No, I mean literally. It's called Wilkomirski syndrome, named after author Binyamin Wilkomirski, who had written about his traumatic experiences as a kid surviving the Holocaust. Turns out it was all made up. He was neither named Wilkomirski nor was he Jewish, but a guy called Braune, who was born in Switzerland. In any case, from the 90s, being a German citizen meant having atoned for the Holocaust and become the most expert voice on it. The New German Pride posed that Germans have already taken responsibility for their Nazi past, grown both personally and politically through this process, and developed empathy for their former victims. As the Jewish Current staff puts it in the article, quote, German philosemitism is revealed as another vehicle for supremacy, preferable precisely because of its anti-racist veneer. So not being German now signified that you are seen as being at much earlier stages of this journey, that you have yet to go through this magnificent process of redemption, and thus that you are a potential threat to the democratic, anti-Semitic German order. From the beginning, leading German politicians and Zionists, including so-called leftist ones, have likened Palestinian national leaders and Arab leaders in general to Nazis. But on a broader international level, this properly started from the 2000s, when Zionist lobbying groups, like the Justice for Jews in Arab countries, were formed to push and lobby for the narrative that over 800,000 Jewish people were expelled by Arabs and settled in Israel as a compensation for the over 70% of Palestinians who were forced out of their homeland during the Nakba, thereby exonerating Palestinian claims of refugee return and to defeat accusations of ethnic cleansing against Israel by creating the double exodus theory. More crudely, this telling served to extend the Holocaust to Iran, North African and Middle Eastern countries. These would have killed the Jews during the war and only did not do so because they were stopped. This propaganda for excusing Zionist ethnic cleansing reached its culmination when Netanyahu held a speech at the World Zionist Congress in October of 2015, saying that Hitler did in fact not plan to massacre the Jews, but only to expel them, and that it was the Palestinian Mufti of Jerusalem who persuaded him to commit a genocide. I talked about the Mufti and the Zionist propaganda surrounding his role in my video on the Nakba. In any case, this had a far-reaching effect in Germany and helped it to double down its smear campaigns against migrants at a time when many Syrian and other Middle Eastern refugees arrived in Germany due to poverty, related climate change, the war in Syria in which Germany was involved, and other factors. But in Europe, singling out Muslim communities for anti-Semitism had already begun. In 2003, against the backdrop of 9/11, the Iraq invasion, and rising pro-Palestine protests against the Israeli massacres during the Second Intifada, 450 representatives of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, met in Vienna, in Austria, and identified a new threat to Western democracy, security, and civilization. Quote, surging in the world to an extent unprecedented since the end of World War II, namely, a new version of anti-Semitism in Europe today that is not a history lesson but a current event, which had a new source and was, quote, coming out of the Arab and Islamic world. The OSCE now aimed to tackle Muslims' perceived failure to learn the right lessons from the Holocaust and to engage them in European remembrance. By 2004, at a conference in Berlin, this goal materialized in practice. Director of the Anti-Defamation League spoke, Islamist campaigns within the Muslim world and Europe have moved the anti-Jewish beliefs within Islam from the fringes, where they historically resided, closer to the center. The members agreed to dedicate huge amounts of resources to fight so-called imported anti-Semitism. Countless organizations popped up throughout Europe with educational programs designed specifically for Muslims. to teach them, quote, resistance to authoritarian structures. It's quite ironic that it was in Berlin and Vienna, the birthplaces of the most genocidal anti-Semitism, where the problem was located outside of Western civilization. In Germany, reports commissioned by the German Ministry of Family Affairs highlighted anti-Semitism, homophobia, and gender discrimination within Muslim communities. A report by the Anti-Semitism Research Center in Berlin identified Muslims as central to rising anti-Semitism in Germany. This led to the formation of the Task Force on Anti-Semitism and Education, which emphasized the need for targeted educational approaches. Government programs like Entimon funded initiatives such as Kreuzberger Initiative Against Anti-Semitism to create educational models for Muslim youth. The Amira project of 2004 focused on addressing anti-Semitism among migrant youth from Muslim families through out-of-school programs. Organizations like the Amadeo Antonio Foundation and the American Jewish Committee Berlin also developed programs targeting Muslims, supported by international, federal, and local funding. Many people don't know that Germany's Domestic Intelligence Agency is involved with the former foundation, the same agency that has been involved in many scandals regarding aiding and downplaying the neo-Nazi threat. By the mid-2000s, funding priorities had shifted away from general anti-Semitism education for mainstream German youth toward programs aimed specifically at Muslims. In 2006, the German Ministry of Family Affairs established the Diversity Does Good action program, designed to target historical and contemporary forms of anti-Semitism. Now, these are very interesting words being used here. While right-wing extremists in East Germany are seen as historically anti-Semitic, Muslim migrants are prone to the so-called contemporary form. What this does is to assign primacy and urgency to this contemporary form, while the historical one is seen as an outmoded historical mistake, which will eventually go away by itself. There have been various proposals and initiatives which condition German citizenship on accepting Israel's right to exist, or even just not posting from the river to the sea online. So becoming German would literally mean becoming Zionist. Note that German citizens who commit anti-Semitic acts would not lose their citizenship with these changes, whereas immigrants are expected to assume Germany's historical guilt while lacking the stability and privileges of native-born citizens. More importantly, German institutions identified anti-Semitism as unique and not comparable whatsoever to Islamophobia and other forms of hate. One reason given is that anti-Semitism saw Jews as part of global conspiracies, which wasn't the case with hatred against Muslims, although there are in fact very real and influential anti-Muslim conspiracy theories, which we'll talk about more in detail in another video. But this taboo became so widespread in Germany that even suggesting a comparison would earn you accusations of anti-Semitism and repeated cases of exclusion from institutions. One prominent example was Wolfgang Benz, an internationally recognized voice of anti-Semitism and Nazi research. Now this guy is a liberal, your average pro-Israel German. But Benz dared to draw comparisons between the anti-Semitism of the Nazi period and current Islamophobia, and demanded to learn whether the same mechanism can also be used to create mischief against other minorities. Just as it was the method of some fascist experts to justify hostility towards Jews with the contents of the Talmud, it's many so-called experts today who argue in a similar way, he explains. Benz also emphasized the similarity between the racist conspiracy theorists, such as Udo Ulfkotte, who invoked a Muslim world revolution and a secret plan to infiltrate non-Muslim states, and said that this was similar to anti-Semites referring to the fabricated protocols of the Elders of Zion. But this, of course, triggered German sensibilities. Before the conference at the Berlin Center for Research on Antisemitism on the topic of enemy image Muslim, enemy image Jew in 2008, a certain political scientist called this a trivialization of the Holocaust, which played down the threat to Israel posed by Islamists' hatred of Jews. That political scientist was Matthias Künzel, former member of the Communist League, who, after its split in the 90s, belonged to the anti-Deutsche faction, anti-German faction, the pro-Israel German pseudo-leftists introduced in the last part. He was later a member of the editorial team of Bahamas, a prominent anti-Deutsche media outlet, an unhinged Muslim-hating rag, which recently earned praise by the prominent far-right ideologue Martin Sellner. The Germans like to say, es kommt zusammen, was zusammengehört. What belongs together, comes together. Many of these pseudo-radicals now establish themselves in dominant German parties and institutions and exert great influence on the anti-Semitism and Palestine-related discourse. Stefan Grigat, for instance, is an anti-Deutsche political scientist and journalist with great influence in media and academia. Since 2022, he heads the Center for Anti-Semitism and Racism Studies in Aachen. Grigat criticizes anti-Semitism as part of the so-called Stalinist left, pointing to the anti-Zionism of the USSR, but also sees anti-Semitism as an essential component of quote-unquote Islamist ideology. In his view, the greatest anti-Semitic threat currently comes from Iran. He co-founded the Stop the Bomb campaign, which literally argued for attacking the country in order to defend Western civilization, including Israel. Mind you, all of this happened amidst surging racist attacks and hate against the Muslim community in Europe, which didn't stop the German ruling class to seek out further offensives and bolster their fortress against the Islamist threat. Germany is home to the largest Palestinian diaspora in Europe, and it therefore has to hit them especially hard, even setting up checkpoints in an Arab and Muslim-majority neighborhood in Berlin, reminding the thousands of Palestinians there of the Israeli occupation. It's important to stress that this type of racialization in German society doesn't just affect Palestinians or Muslims, but all those Muslim-adjacent in the eyes of European Orientalism. So a non-religious Kurd, for instance, is also affected by this constructed separation between the civilized whites and the barbaric browns. Before World War II, half of the Turkish background population in Germany was Jewish. Thousands of Turkish Jews were deported to concentration camps such as Auschwitz, not to mention the countless Muslims and Arabs who died and fought against the Nazis, many among them who had lived in Germany for a long time. But this confuses the distinct lines between victim and perpetrator. Historian Mark David Baer reveals how Turks, Arabs, and other Muslims were present in Holocaust-era Germany, but later erased from its national memory. When Muslim minority German youth empathize with Holocaust victims, this is seen by ethnic Germans as competing for victimhood, leading to accusations of anti-Semitism and silencing. Expressing fear is dismissed as ignorance of and an affront to how Germany has redeemed itself since the 1930s. Özürek argues in her book that Muslim background Germans are expected to first empathize with Nazi perpetrators or their descendants, repenting on their behalf as a prerequisite for joining the German social contract. To seek acceptance, they must sympathize with white Germans who bear Holocaust guilt, embodying the shared responsibility Karl Jaspers envisioned for post-Holocaust German society. The public focus shifted from portraying Muslim women as victims to framing Muslim men as trespassers. This peaked in 2015 with the influx of mostly male Syrian and other Middle Eastern Muslim refugees to Germany, triggering widespread violence against Muslim men and refugees across the country. Whereas some earlier social initiatives emphasized support for Muslim men, they now shifted to viewing them as perpetrators. Quote, "The Muslim man is stigmatized in the name of freedom, democracy, and human rights, and is objected as the antithesis of these principles. He is recognized as seeking honor and respect primarily through violence and the oppression of women, means that are incompatible with the ethical subject of a democracy." As opposed to ethnic Germans, Muslim background people in Germany do not have Nazi grandparents. This makes it impossible for them to show that they are also atoning for past Nazi crimes, and they are thus, per default, morally inferior. Fortunately for Germans, they can rely on Arab traitors to do their bidding for them.
Der Nahen Osten funktioniert anders. Die Mentalität ist anders. Wenn Israel jetzt Schwäche zeigt, wenn sie nicht in der Lage ist, die formulierten Ziele, und zwar die Vernichtung von Gaza, auch erfolgreich zu betreiben, wird sie gefressen.
Most prominent among them right now, Ahmad Mansour, a Palestinian who migrated to Germany in 2006 and who became known for his work at the Green Party-affiliated Heroes program. He is firmly established in German institutions, appears on all the dominant newspapers and TV news shows, and has received various awards for his work. Mansour's book, Generation Allah, combines personal experiences and pseudo-scientific claims to portray homogenized Muslim psychoculture as oppressive and harmful. He depicts Muslim families as authoritarian, stifling independence, and fostering verbal and emotional abuse, which he claims leads to radicalization among youth. In his social program, Heroes, which works with young men from the Arab world, Turkey, Kurdistan, or Albania and Kosovo, Mansour equates honor culture with Islam, which prevents Muslims from adopting democratic values. Drawing from the theories of authoritarian personality we mentioned at the beginning, he claims these dynamics produce rigid moral views, intolerance, and preoccupation with violence and sex. Naturally, the logic goes, if Adorno could determine the risks of fascism through analyzing the authoritarian personality of many Germans, the psychology of people that gets reproduced through so-called Muslim culture bears the risk of a renewed widespread anti-Semitism and then fascism. Isn't that ironic? Western imperialist institutions rely on a network of ex-Muslims to make the spreading of Islamophobia more palatable to the wider public. It was ironic when the ex-Muslim, atheist, pro-Zionist suspected person attacked the Christmas market in Magdeburg. The first reaction of conservatives and even some liberals was to utilize this to rant against the threat of Islamism in the West, going so far as inventing the notion that the right-wing, Saudi-background lunatic was in truth suppressing his belief in Islam. Otherwise, there'd be no reason for him to do such a thing.
Ask yourself, why would an atheist threaten ex-Muslims? It doesn't make sense. This is a classic example of taqiyya, an Islamic practice that allows Muslims to lie and deceive to advance Islamic goals or agendas.
The AfD leader literally cried because she was so sad about this, when the guy was literally a fan of her party. If an Arab Islamophobe can't be found, there's other tricks to spread Islamophobia in the 21st century without making it obvious, is to be careful not to rant against Muslims directly. Green Party leader Katharina Dröge failed at this, speaking about the poison of Islam in parliament. She didn't apologize and said it was obvious that what she meant was in truth Islamism. Now imagine if the same happened with Judaism or any other religious community. But this was obviously less of a random mistake, but rather a Freudian slip. As author of the Islamophobia industry put it, quote, "In an attempt to be more specific with their language, progressives have distinguished themselves from their rightist counterparts by resisting the temptation to deploy blanket statements about Islam, and instead focus on the religion's foreignism affix, Islamism. Yet, it is not as benevolent of a shift as some may expect. Islamism has become a code word in recent years and used to maintain focus on the Muslim community. But the most effective way to spread bigotry and divide and weaken the working class is to paint the marginalized Muslim background community as potential oppressors, that is, by painting them as inherently prone to homophobia, sexism, and most prominently, anti-Semitism." Unsurprisingly, and needless to say, studies have in fact not proven the theory of imported anti-Semitism. The Antisemitismus in Deutschland report, conducted by the German Ministry of the Interior itself, finds that no systematic study has yet shown that Muslim background Germans are significantly more anti-Semitic than non-Muslim Germans, and that there was no distinct new Islamic anti-Semitism. Despite these findings, the German government disproportionately allocates more and more millions of euros to combat Muslim anti-Semitism, even though right-wing white Germans are responsible for most anti-Semitic hate crimes and other acts of racism. Just a short side info about the ministry. In 2014, so 3 years after this report's release, and almost 70 years after the fall of Hitler, the Federal Ministry of the Interior finally commissioned a group of historians to investigate its Nazi past. And what did they find? Between 1949 and 1970, the proportion of former Nazi Party members employed at the ministry was 54%. So in 2011, when it still refused to bend to pressures to investigate itself, the ministry felt it had the moral high ground on addressing anti-Semitism. And we need to remember that these are German reports, which means they regard anti-Zionism as a form of anti-Semitism, equating opposition to settler colonialism with neo-Nazi views. On top of that, they also suggest, without any real evidence, that anti-Semitic ideas are transmitted through Middle Eastern media, which are then passed on to children in the living room. The underlying presumption here is that it would be otherwise impossible to contract anti-Semitism in a denazified Germany. So, are there Muslims who are anti-Semitic? Aren't there some countries where anti-Semitism is more prevalent than in others? See, all of these questions are irrelevant to the problem we're dealing with. Replace Muslims with Jews, Islam with Judaism in all of these sweeping statements and reports and discussions, and see what it does to your inner feelings. It is very telling, for instance, that the report focuses on Iranian or Arabic media, and does not engage with immigration from other countries where anti-Semitism is quite prevalent, like Poland, Romania, or Ukraine. Most notably and most egregiously, the 2011 report, which would shape German foreign policy for the next decade, overlooks the overwhelming primary source of anti-Semitism in Germany: far-right, white, Christian background Germans. Most anti-Semitic attitudes among Muslim background people are linked to the contemporary political developments in the Middle East, not inherited Nazi ideologies. If, for instance, a Muslim Palestinian struggles to understand how Israel is permitted to act as it does and consequently attributes disproportionate Zionist influence to Western states, this is simply not the same level of bad as when an organized white German longs for the return of concentration camps. Also, which among these groups of people is institutionally closer to the power centers in Germany? The Muslims who are assaulted from all sides by dominant institutions, or people close to the party that is literally about to form a new government? Now, if you think that all of this can't get more absurd, wait until you hear about this next report. In response to October 7th, the competent Center for Research on Right-Wing Extremism and Democracy at Leipzig University published the Authoritarianism Study 2024, which reported an alarming result. 14 to 15% of the population in Germany completely agree with statements of post-colonial anti-Semitism. What does that mean? This form of anti-Semitism is measured by agreement with these three statements. 1. The German guilt complex hinders the Palestinian struggle for freedom. 2. Israel was founded so that Europeans would not have a guilty conscience. And 3. The Middle East conflict is a conflict between white colonialism and a minority of oppressed people. So basically every normal human being with basic history knowledge is a post-colonial anti-Semite. The fact that they registered this also among the far right just shows how methodologically flawed this study is. The AfD and its voters are the ones who have been calling for a ban on public funding of post-colonial studies for years, because it and its voters are the least able to tolerate criticism of European and, above all, German colonialism. In April of 2019, the AfD in the German Bundestag requested that all funding for BDS-related groups be withdrawn and that the movement be banned under the law on associations. But this blurred distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism also fits the definition of anti-Semitism in the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IHRA, which classifies anti-Zionism, boycotts and accusations of racism against Israel as anti-Semitic. Since 2024, this is the official position of Germany. But linking post-colonial studies to anti-Semitism is not a novelty in Germany. In 2020, renowned Cameroonian post-colonial historian and political scientist Achille Mbembe was disinvited from a German literary festival due to his support for the BDS movement and for his comparisons of Israel's policies to South African apartheid, and this with the Holocaust. This ignited what became known as Historians' Dispute 2.0. Felix Klein, the German government's anti-Semitism commissioner, said that Mbembe had relativized the Holocaust and questioned Israel's right to exist. In 2023, he said that merely calling Israel an apartheid state is anti-Semitic. Though scholar Michael Rothberg criticized the parallel to the first Historians' Dispute because it has been used by representatives of official German interpretation of the Holocaust to compare intellectuals like himself to the ones like Ernst Nolte and others we mentioned in the last part. Remember that they argued that Stalin and communism were a greater and predecessor crime to Nazism, claiming that Nazi Germany deserved at least some recognition for opposing it. It's ironic that the same people who feel no shame in comparing Palestine protesters to the Waffen-SS have a problem with situating the Holocaust in a broader European colonial context to enrich the analysis of its causes. Several works came out during this time that offended and scratched the German monopoly on Holocaust memory, exploring the connections of slavery, colonialism, and the Holocaust. Australian genocide scholar Dirk Moses argues that German memory culture has become a civil religion, declaring the uniqueness of the Holocaust, calling it a catechism. Or, as another professor called it, something that yet again made the Germans a special people. Remember that Germany only recognized the first genocide of the 20th century over 100 years after they committed it. In January 2024, Namibia's late president strongly attacked Germany for its unhinged support of Israel's genocide, while it has still not atoned for the one it committed in Namibia. The imported anti-Semitism narrative is yet another tool to continue the genocidal colonial European legacy under capitalist imperialism by establishing a separation line between redeemed Western civilization and the uncivilized people of the global South, and the uncivilized foreign Muslims, so that they can be dominated both outside and inside Germany. According to a poll conducted on the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II, more than half of Germans expressed a desire to move on from constantly reminding themselves of the burden of Nazi Germany, while at the same time 77% maintained that the Holocaust and National Socialism should never be forgotten. This reaffirms that many Germans want to have their cake and eat it too, that is, distancing themselves from historical guilt and enjoying a proud, whitewashed German nationalism. But the worst consequence of the imported anti-Semitism theory is that it casts marginalized, racialized, and disadvantaged groups as perpetrators. When the narrative establishes Muslims as inherently likely to be anti-Semitic, or worse, as unwilling to atone for their anti-Semitism, it obscures their status as victims of European racism. This dynamic reinforces the intensification of European supremacist policies like massive deportations and huge investments in national or border security to guard against the coming crises, firmly ingraining the Festung Europa mentality. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss my upcoming video, where we'll dive deeper into this trend and explore the secret Nazi connections of the ascending German party, which probably best symbolizes the current rise of the far right all over the world. The Alternative für Deutschland, short, the AfD.
And fuck Israel.